Cyber-Feminist Urbanism, a conversation with Maja-Lee Voigt on hacking the corporate computation design of cities. We would love to hear about you, your work, and I think the first things came to my mind is what is the story behind coming to the idea of cyber-feminist city?
Yeah, that's a very good question that still kind of haunts me sometimes still, because it came out of a work with the Akteuren für urbanen Ungehorsam, which we did in the framework of our Master-Thesis. And we got a little bit into like techno-capitalism, thinking about platform cities. And we did some research on the tech company Lieferando, which is also like a food delivery service. And we talked to writers and went further into like their resistive practices against how the algorithm manages their work life and also their ways through the city. And we continued that work over the past years, and it just made me think of what are more resistive practices against this kind of increasing agenda that we see within cities that get smarter, that get more computational, that political agendas want to be more digitalized in various ways of everyday life. And just thinking through that was kind of dystopic in a way. It was sort of like a doom subject sometimes. And there was a sort of hopelessness also because we're talking about this big tech companies and the privatization of public spaces, especially, and also increased through the pandemic where digital spheres got so much more important. And that just made me think, okay, what are resistive practices that really deal with the smartification of cities from like a bottom-up perspective, or like you say, like a grassroots urbanism perspective? And what are those spaces that are more independently thinking about alternative infrastructures, about infrastructures of care, about sustainable digitality, about like a digital public space maybe even. And I came across these collectives, these Hack-feminist collectives as I call them, that are in various cities, usually located in city or urban spaces, and are a gathering of various group sizes, mostly only for FLINTA, which is like a German acronym for women, inter-agender, trans, and now I lost the context. Okay, let me start again.
FLINTA?
Yeah. FLINTA, which is a German acronym for women, inter-agender, trans, and non-binary identifying humans.
Okay. Yeah, I got it.
And they were trying to make these spaces both accessible for a broader public, but also exclusive to these gender identities, because they realized that technologies today and computation itself is very, very focused on binary narratives and binary computational mechanisms. And they just wanted to create sort of braver spaces, as they call them, not safer space, but braver space, as in like trying to create an environment that is open to learning tech together within these specific contexts and narratives, make hardware, especially like tech knowledge, more accessible to marginalized perspectives, and yeah, just tinker together, have a sort of like freedom of an in-between space to create stuff, to try out specific things with technology, think through technology together, also from a very theoretical perspective, and translate that into like the city life, but also the digital life, and just kind of like intertwine both of these spheres.
Very interesting, to be honest. And then, so you got introduced with these collectives, and you started doing ethnography work with them. Did you also got yourself a member there? And for example, did you also work in any collective in Hamburg? Because I just saw some of your works. It was one in Köln, one in Berlin, and
I also talked to Miss Baltazar's laboratory in Vienna.
Okay, yeah.
And the Haecksen, which is like a German-speaking broader collective that does not have a specific location, but they have various locations in urban space. And I did talk to 2 persons from the Hamburg collective as well, which is like where I was based. The problem was, though, that during that time we were facing lockdowns and very, very strict, and I mean, that totally makes sense that they were strict at that time. Contact restrictions. So the spaces were all closed. All of who I talked to were at home. And I kind of conducted that research as an ethnography behind the screen. So that meant talking to the members of these collectives intensively. I did qualitative interviews, but I was also trying to sort of, because we were talking about spaces very specifically and how technology influences spaces, I was trying to create a digital space within the online. So we didn't use Zoom, we used Jitsi, which is like an open source alternative to kind of like translate what they're for. You know, they're standing for open source technologies, they're standing for collectively created infrastructures, tech infrastructures. So I tried to pick up on this ideal and tried to create also like digital spaces where we could meet, and I invited them for like a cyber coffee. In the end, I recreated the whole space of one of the collectives, the treeshuttle in Berlin, in a digital space to kind of make people who want to understand these spaces experience that space in the virtual as well. So I was really playing with the idea of intertwining these both spheres, especially when talking about spaces. And I'm totally aware that talking about spaces is very different from experiencing those spaces. And I think there are a lot of voids within that perspective. I think it's, as I said, it's different to experience them, but still it was very interesting to have that sort of distance, and the members also being distanced from these spaces forcefully through the pandemic made them reflect more on the spaces and made them also name specific things that they might not have named while in the spaces. So that was an interesting point of view at that time to be able to collectively reflect on what these spaces mean, how specific things are spatialized, also how infrastructures are spatialized. So that was, very cool to just be able to try it out and experience that, and with the tools that I had during the pandemic to really also explore the virtual with derives, which are like observatory walks through the digital. So I like not strolling, but scrolling through the timeline and the feeds and everything. Trying to observe various narratives and discussions around the topic and everything. Experimenting a little bit with digital ethnography, especially from like an urban and very spatial perspective within that virtual realm.
But in your work I read, for example, you also explain and describe the table. From the top, you're like what you're going to see. Were you there, or that was the description of the members?
Yes, that was the description of my interview partner. Yeah,
that's so interesting. The whole, the how you walk from that table to another table in your paper. It was really interesting to read. I could easily imagine. I could help me to imagine the whole space. And talking about the space. This is a very hot topic at the moment when we come to digital urbanism, what urban space is. We all know that there is the world the sphere between digital and analog or these two worlds are quite fuzzy. It got more and more fuzzy, and you talk about space in between, or also interspace. We have works of Graham, for example, that talk about code in a space. Empirically, I want to know in practice, how did you see they're practicing urban space? Because in one point, as long as in one space you can play out, you can experience life, and you can find your peers and unite with your allies, you are practicing urban space. That could be digital or non-digital. But I want to know how these practices, for example, saw urban space, how they conceptualize urban space, how they practice urban space.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you so much. Especially because the cyber-feminist collectives or the hack-feminist collectives that I approached did have a similar question, like what can we contribute to urban space, or to urban studies, not urban space. They do contribute a lot to urban space already. But they were kind of irritated by my question, because they're like, you're an urban scholar, like how can we talk about it together? And that was definitely a challenge, and also like an analytical tool that I put on after. I was like, I think there are very important urban actors that we have to take into consideration while trying to fight for a right to the digital city, as like Shaw and Graham, for example, declarized. And thus I was at first trying to look at their very specific urban contexts. As I said, I couldn't be there at the time. So it was all very much based on what they told me and how we could kind of talk about it. But it turned out that their spaces were, as an infrastructure, very important, because the materialized spaces, the spaces where they came together, where they tinkered with hardware, where they started conversations about overcoming sexism, racism, classism, ableism, and all that stuff. It was so important to be in the room together, and to also maintain spaces together. If it's like, kind of doing the dishes, one of my interview partners said, or trying to just share responsibilities for these spaces and trying to uphold these spaces. But within the urban context, I noticed that they were all sort of spaces that I would localize in an in-between. They were very, very well curated spaces within, but from the outside, they were, for example, hard to reach. As with the collective in Cologne, they had trouble finding a space in the city center, so they had to move to a more marginalized space, and also politically marginalized neighborhood. And you literally walk into like a house back end and then see the door only if you walk into the back end. And the same was with the collective in Berlin, with the treeshuttle, as they call it, Baumschiff, which is a former space. They're not in there anymore, but it was like on the back end of a Kreuzberg house, which is a very central location, which is good, but still you had to literally climb up a ladder to get into the space. So those were just examples. And also the space in Vienna, they're in a working class neighborhood. They're central, but there are also very right-wing politics around them and within the neighborhood. And also the spaces by the Haecksen, which is like the German central collective for hack feminists. They only had temporary spaces within like within events, and just trying to build temporary spaces for their own. So within that localization, they were very in between, but also in between societal conceptions, because they noticed that technology was predominantly male, predominantly cis male dominated and white, and they were trying to make technology more accessible for a broader public, or to just educate on tech literacy. So that was also sort of like a societal between their own space, where they were already living these societal ideals that they think should be implemented into tech, but also space itself, like urban public space, and the sort of outside, which is also a problematic term, I guess, but for that matter, so they found themselves in a very in-between situation as well, and also trying to be open to, you know, a more broader public beyond Flinter, and trying to have events that address more than Flinter, and but still trying to create these safer spaces, which is always an ongoing negotiation of exclusion, not exclusion. Who do you invite? Who do you not invite? Who do you include? Who's feeling welcomed or not? So that was like a in-between space thing that I noticed. And then there's like the interspace that you mentioned, which I kind of created as a term for my own, because I think there's still not an everyday use of the interconnection of digitality and the analog, which I think is intertwined all the time. Like you said, it's fuzzy. There are no borders there anymore. It's what, I don't know, Nathan Jurgensen, I'm sorry, let me say that again. It's what Nathan Jurgensen calls like digital dualism, that people are just constantly trying to keep up the difference between the analog and the digital, and still talking about real life, even though, I mean, everything is real life. Also, what you do online is as real as what you do on the streets. What you do on the screen is as real as what you do in public space. So I thought the interspace, this in-betweenness, this constant interconnection between these spheres, is maybe more of like an everyday use that we can also use, it's more of an everyday term that we can also use for city space, thinking what the digital does to the material, how this is connected with each other on so many dimensions. And that's why I kind of wanted to conceptualize a term that kind of reflected also the concept that you were talking about by Dodge and Kitchin, but also Zook and Graham, and just kind of think this a little further for the contemporary urban space.
So in your work also, you talked about glitching culture, and in general, the term you came with interspace, and the concept behind that, I think, is also, it sounds to be based on a trajectory of related feminist work on binary, and how the binary concept of the world affecting space, and how to contest this kind of concept. And as I said, I saw you were talking about glitching culture and glitching space. I just wanted to know how you relate yourself to this trajectory of thought, like glitching feminism, of legacy Russel.
Yeah, sure. My work is deeply rooted within her Glitch Feminism manifesto, because I was reading it right before I was starting to write my thesis, and it just influenced the way that I looked at the whole topic. And also what I came upon within her work was a lot of in-betweenness, a lot of these topics that I was just referring to. So there were two things that really stuck out to me. That was first that she was talking about architectures a lot. She was using that term specifically, which resonated with me as an urban scholar at like the intersection of urban cultural studies, but also urban design, which has to do a lot with architectures and a lot of social architectures. But what she brought into the conversation specifically for me was the algorithmic architectures, to think of algorithms as architectures as like pre-programmed ways to navigate through the digital, which architectures in the materialized spaces of the city, for example, are also doing. They're helping us navigate, orientate, and everything. And she was also talking about that on the podcast, Tech Won't Save Us. Big shout out to both of those because I'm a huge fan. And this was super interesting. And she was also talking about N-architectures, which I think or understand as resistive architectures, like the Hack feminist collectives, which built their own infrastructures of tech, of care, of being together, of also imaginaries and future narrators. And those, I think, at the moment are still architectures that do not, they're not on the same page as the smart city agendas and political agendas that are really collaborating with tech firms, which privatize urban public spaces, which are patented, which do not seem to be open for discussion of a public or, a broader conversation within, city collectives in general. So that term really, really resonated with me, and she's really, calling to build N-architectures. And this is where the glitch comes into play, because she's specifically saying that the glitch is sort of like a gateway to revolutionize the system, to be bold. And that's where I kind of thought, okay, these glitches that are definitely within every technological system, it's an error that you can't predict because it's always within a technology. Like every technology has some functionalities that don't work the way they're supposed to, which is the glitch at the end of the day. And these glitches, I thought, also with the works of Mackenzie Wark, for example, were the gateway for the hack for me, because I was like, okay, when there's a glitch, when there's an entryway, sort of, where we see that systems do not function the way that they're programmed or coded, this is the possibility to slide in and be resistant and to refuse these systems and to not be legible, as Russel puts it too. And she's also bringing in this very bodily dimension of queer bodies, of Black bodies, for example, who are very, no, let me say that again. I need to think about that for a second. Illegible is if you can't read it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Okay, and Lexi Russell is bringing in this very bodily dimension of the glitch, of illegible bodies, queer bodies, also Black bodies that are dominantly affected by discrimination through facial recognition, for example, especially women of color, especially queer women of color, or gender non-binary identifying persons. And who fall through any classification that computational systems are trying to put upon them in a way. And this is a very interesting and very productive way, I think, of also connecting it to hack feminism, because what I saw within Ms. Baltazar's laboratory in Vienna, for example, they were really playing with bodily representation. They were drawing against gender binary ideologies, against right-wing ideologies, nationalist ideologies, through just making visible bodies that apparently, according to these ideologies, do not fit within their standards and stuff like that, but who nevertheless are a very important part of urban life and city life and of a spectrum of gender identities that needs to be represented, that needs to find representation within the urban space as well. And what they did, for example, they do have sort of like a gallery within their space. So they use their showcase to really promote alternative and very diverse visualizations of a gender spectrum, to just give them some representation and to say, we're here, and you can't just, X-code us out of the urban, as Joy Buolamwini, for example, puts it in her work.
I saw, I think, one of the videos on Vimeo. Was quite interesting, but there was something in it that you also mentioned that in your own presentation one time, and I still sense a kind of very good, very positive power of doing such collectives. But as you also brought it up, still was most of them, at least the videos I was seeing, and also my own experience of doing or trying to be a member of some of this collective in Hamburg, it is still predominantly white.
Yeah, unfortunately, yes.
And did they themselves reflected on that, or what is your reflection on?
Yeah, so I think this is also a lack of my work, because obviously I'm a white woman. I have limited experiences with discrimination, and I'm not intersectionally discriminated or anything, and I cannot stand for these perspectives, but I can stand by these perspectives and behind these perspectives, which I think is very important. And as I said, there's like not one answer. It's really a very difficult thing to negotiate, also because I think they're very they have a very educational background. A lot of them meet at university, which is also like a barrier. It's not super accessible for some, I think. And also the knowledge hierarchy between people who know a lot about tech and who know how to program and who are really into these discourses and really identify with these is obviously very high within these spaces. But what they do really well, I think, from what I could observe and what I could see, and also what I experienced within these spaces some time, was that they keep on trying to say, we're open, you can come here as a total newbie, which is like a total beginner with no knowledge at all. We're a knowledge community, so we're trying to share this knowledge in a sense of like an urban common, to share knowledge, share resources, share also hardware and all the things that you need to actually access the digitality or access knowledge about the digital. And I'm doing a programming course myself right now at one of these spaces. And I have to say they do a really, really good job, because I have no idea about how to program. My tech knowledge is very limited to what I know within social discourses and within the discourses that I'm rooted within, but not from a very technological perspective. I'm going to be open about that, which I think is also a lack of the work that we do, because yes, we know how to analyze stuff, we know how to interpret things, and we can put them in a specific context, but I still think it's important to also have a broad idea of how the technology really works. How does programming work? How are programming languages working as well? So I'm trying to get into this a little bit further, and I'm doing this within one of these Hackspaces, and the instructor is doing a tremendous job to be really, really low key and start at the bottom of everything. And I do admire that. I think actually academia could learn a lot from that. I myself have difficulties to translate all the theoretical stuff that I do to a more everyday understanding of what I conceptualize. So I think that's that's honorable in a way, but I still think that's an issue, these spaces being predominantly white. But I do think they're working on it. So there's hope, and there's a constant negotiation and discussion about it. So let's hope that this changes soon.
Yeah, and great point about that, how they are reaching out and how they are teaching. I think I should also being more in contact with them and learn a lot. I think my last question is about governance and the affair between these collectives and, for example, municipality. For example, in Berlin, Smart City Strategy, which they are now working on that, there is alliance like Bundes, like alliance, which I think is quite very new, good approach they are doing. So basically, civil organizations, universities, and public institutions are all part of this alliance to monitor the way this strategy is being written. Of course, there's a lot of fight already inside of that. Some organizations already left this alliance, but I want to know if these collectives try to approach these organizations, try to position themselves in working with municipality, or raising their voice in a way that also translated in municipality level.
Yeah, this is definitely a question I also asked them. I have to say that some of them were just at the start of forming their collectives and not very institutionalized yet, in that sense that they had their own spaces and infrastructures built up and everything. And it was also, as I said, during the pandemic, where everything was kind of like up in the air, and they were trying to stay in touch with each other first before reaching out. But yes, there have been various points where they were communicating with municipalities in various ways. I think one of the examples, or one thing in general, is funding, since they're open spaces that are trying to constantly get funding because they're not getting paid for the work that they do. They're all volunteers there. And they at least try to get public city fundings for their spaces to pay rent, for example. That has been a thing that most of them were trying to do. So that is like one point where they got in touch with the city as of like a general administrative perspective. But then also within the work that they did, especially F.U.C.K.001 who were working in Cologne, they were, I think from the understanding that I got, was they were trying during the pandemic to reach out to the city and say, we have an open source server, we have a Big Blue Button server that they set up, and they were also trying to give access to like groups nearby, to educational institutions like schools, who were still struggling what software they should use, and if Zoom is the best alternative, because we know Zoom is a big tech cooperative also, and they just built up that alternative infrastructure. But from what I got from the interviews, I might be wrong how this turned out ultimately, but there was no interest from the city to pick it up and say, okay, we're gonna think through that together, and we're gonna try to, I don't know, maybe you could consult us on these issues, and we could, start a conversation about open source tech and how to use it and how to be more publicly accessible for everybody without giving away your data and your privacy and all of that. From what I got from the interviews, this was very frustrating most of the time. However, I think, especially from like an educational institution perspective, a lot of things have changed over the past year since I conducted my research. So this might have, changed. This was just like within that moment that I conducted the research. But there have been difficulties to start a conversation together. And I think it's both from sort of maybe also like an invisibility of these Hackspaces to urban governmental structures, but they're also doing a lot of public talks, and they're present at a lot of events that are specifically concerned with technology and with tech regulation and all these matters. So I think this is like a bad excuse, basically. I do think they have to approach each other a lot more. And I do see the city, as well as also urban planners, as well as urban scholars like myself, in the responsibility to start a conversation and to be open and to see that those Hack feminist collectives are very important actors. And they can still say they're not interested in that, and that would be totally okay if they want to concentrate on their collective work and everything. That's a lot of work within itself. It's a lot of maintenance, it's a lot of repair, it's a lot of energy that goes into, and it's predominantly made by Flinta, who have a lot of care responsibilities in their everyday lives. And that's also a thing that I had to think about a lot during my work. It's ask a lot to just ask for an interview, and I want to be careful with the time of my interview partners and acknowledge their responsibilities without because I don't have a budget for my work. So that's an issue also within academia. So I do see the city being responsible to start this conversation and to look what they can learn from these collectives, because I think that's a lot. They can learn a lot.
For sure. Yeah. Thank you so much. It was very interesting, and I hope everybody also that are listening, also like me, being drawn by very nice insights and your ethnography works that you've done with them. And I hope also this episode give a very small, tiny visibility of what they have done. I'm trying for the description of this episode, I'm trying to write down some of the collectives you worked on. Also, you are writing your paper. You have a paper under publication, which the name is "We Build This City on Rocks and Feminist Code: Hacking Corporate Computation Design of Cities to Come." So I would like just to say to the people who are listening to this episode that if you register yourself in the newsletter of this podcast, as soon as this paper come out, we're going to inform you. And good luck with further work on this subject. I know that was your master thesis, but I know you're still working on that. And I'm happy to see more work on this subject in other places, in other presentations, and also in other podcasts. Thank you so much. And also, I would like to thank Ben for providing the infrastructure, and Mattern for recording, editing, and helping us today. I would like also Maja-Lee to, if you have some words.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated being here. As we dedicate this episode to the Iranian women and Flinta out there protesting, I think the subject also touches on all the Flinta movements that we've seen in the past years. So be aware of that, acknowledge these, spread the word, and give them the visibility and the representation that we've been talking about in the digital, but also in the analog spaces.
Thank you so much.
کارم را از من بگیره